We're now going to start taking a look at the discipline of macroeconomics. The way that we're going to do this is through the book Meltdown. Meltdown was written by Thomas Woods, and it's about the 2008 financial crisis, mostly the housing market crash and then the results of the housing market crash on the rest of the economy. Now, this book is written from the perspective of the Austrian School of Economics. This is a fairly small school. A lot of people don't know a lot about it. But the reason why I've chosen this book is because when I looked at what happened during 2008, what caused the crash, and the response to the crash, this is the book that lined up most with what I observed. So that's why we're going to look at this book. Now, what you have to understand is that this book, again, contrasts a lot with some of the other economic theories that are out there. So it's really up to you to make up your mind which parts of the book are right, which parts of the book are a stretch, and which parts of the book that you think aren't correct at all. And then kind of fill in the gaps with the ideas that come from the other economic theories. Now, a lot of these concepts are going to be unfamiliar to you. So if at any point you don't understand something that I'm talking about, stop the recording. Go and look it up. Now, I'm going to do my best to try and give you examples to break this down some to give you a better understanding of what's going on. But again, if what I tell you doesn't give you everything that you need, stop it. Go to Investopedia. Go to other websites, again, reputable websites that are going to be able to tell you something about what it is that you don't know. You're going to need to recall a lot of the ideas that we talked about in American government. Economics, American government, in fact, all social studies disciplines overlap. So you're going to want to remember the things that we talked about in government to give you a better perspective of why the people in charge made the decisions that they made in order to try to get us out of the economic crash. And then finally, this is the type of reading that you're going to have to be able to do independently in college. Now, I'm going to try to guide you as much as I can through this during these next few weeks, but you have to be able to do this on your own or with the help of a study group when you move on to college next year. Good luck. Before we get into the reading, we need to go over a few things that will help you to understand what you're going to see in this first chapter. The first thing you guys need to know is that list over on your left of all of the key terms that we've either talked about already or that we will talk about pretty soon here. So macroeconomics. Remember that the prefix macro simply means big. Okay, it's the opposite of micro. Micro means little. We're going to look at small parts in microeconomics. In macroeconomics, we're going to look at the decisions that are made nationally, globally, regionally, decisions that impact everybody in the economic system. You should already know what a free market is. We just discussed invisible hand in microeconomics. Now, Keynesian is going to be another one of those schools of economic thought. It was founded by John Maynard Keynes, and what it is it believes that in order to get out of an economic recession or depression, that the government should spend a lot of money to stimulate the economy. So it's what we call demand side economics, as opposed to what I'm going to be teaching you, which is what we call supply side. Regulations. You already know that regulations are rules that governments make in order to try and protect individuals or protect communities, or even just to make commerce work a little bit better. Debt. Debt is money that's owed. The national debt is the money that a nation owes in total. So it's the accumulated debt over the entire span of that country's history. Then a deficit is going to be the debt that is accumulated in 1 year. Okay? And then deficit spending is when a government spends more money than it brings in revenues. So you've heard me talk about this a lot with the United States. Right now, we are running a lot of deficits. The last time that we had a balanced budget, which means that revenues were equal to costs or to what was spent, was back in the 1990s. Make sure you know, what is the difference between micro and macroeconomics, which I just went over? How is the invisible hand related to the free market? What does a Keynesian believe? And what is the difference between the national debt and the national deficit? Those are your 4 big questions that are your starting points. Since the fall of 2008, as the stock market plummeted, companies folded, and economic fear and uncertainty began to spread, Americans have been bombarded with a predictable and relentless refrain: the free market economy has failed. The remedy, according to Barack Obama, the late Bush administration, Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and the mainstream media, it's more regulation, more government intervention, more spending, more money creation, and more debt. To add insult to injury, the very people who devised the policies that produced the mess are now posing as the wise public servants who will show us the way out. Following a familiar pattern, government failure has been blamed on anyone and everyone but the government itself. And of course, that same government failure is being used to justify further increases in government power. So let's look at what Thomas Woods is saying here. His argument is that the reason why the 2008 crash occurred is because of government intervention in the economy. What his argument is that through government intervention, the markets were distorted. So instead of people going out and buying things on their own, being guided by, again, Adam Smith's invisible hand, he's saying that the government actually gave people more incentive to go out and buy certain products over other products. In this case in particular, houses. Okay, and we'll take a look at the defense of his argument later on as he begins to break down how this occurred. But he then goes on to say that because the government is the one who distorted the market and caused the crash, they were also the ones who were supposed to come up with the answer to fix the problems that they created. He's then going to argue later on, they didn't even recognize their own failures. So if they couldn't recognize their own failures and the causes of the crash, how could they be the ones to then go out and fix it? The final sentence of that page is very important. Again, it says, and of course, the same government failure is being used to justify further increases in government power. Recall from American government, we talked about the Leviathan, and that in Thomas Hobbes's view of the Leviathan, it's the sea monster that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It gets bloated and more bloated and more bloated. So what we know is that in times of crisis or in times of depression or recession like we went through in 2008 or the Great Depression back in the 1930s, the government is going to use those sorts of situations to justify creating more power for themselves. If we look at the Great Depression, we have all sorts of government programs and agencies that were created during the Great Depression that never went away once the Depression was over. We're going to see the same thing happen in 2008, where government agencies are going to be created in 2008, but once that problem is solved and the issues are over, those agencies aren't just going to go away, and the government has therefore taken more power unto itself. The talking heads have been about their usual business of giving the wrong answers to every important question, but this time most of them haven't even been asking the right questions. So a talking head is also known as a pundit. These are the types of people that you see go on a news program. They are asked questions and they give answers that are either pre-formulated or that are going to support whichever political party it is that they support. Where did all the excess risk, leverage, and debt, not to mention the housing bubble itself, come from? So a housing bubble, or a bubble in economic terms is when you see too much investment or too much demand in a certain area. And so it's like when you blow air into a bubble. If you're chewing on a piece of bubble gum and you blow air into it, you're making the bubble and the bubble and the bubble bigger. What eventually happens to that bubble? It's going to burst. So whenever we see too many resources or too much money going into a particular market that isn't in line with what would have normally gone into that market, we'd say that a bubble is being created. When questions like this are raised, the answers are, to say the least, unhelpful. Excessive risk-taking simply begs the question. As several economists have noted, blaming the crisis on greed is like blaming plane crashes on gravity. And this is one of the things that we did see in 2008 is that wherever you looked on TV, you had somebody that was saying, oh, this entire thing was caused by greed. But what was the apparatus that allowed that greed to actually create the situation that we're in? Were there regulations that were ignored? Were there laws that were ignored? Did we have political pressure on certain institutions in order to have favored voting blocks benefit from certain politicians' moves? Okay, all of that stuff could have gone into what some people just called greed. And you really have to break down what was going on there in order to be able to figure out what caused the crisis so that you can then put things in place to keep that crisis from happening again. We've been looking in the wrong place. The current crisis was caused not by the free market, but by the government's intervention in the market. This is not special pleading on behalf of the market, but the clear verdict of both theory and experience. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, government-sponsored enterprises that enjoy various government privileges alongside their special tax and regulatory breaks, were able to draw far more resources into the housing market, into the housing sector than would have been possible on the free market. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are both quasi-government institutions. They're somewhat private, but they're also somewhat public, which I mean by government run. And so because they're somewhat government run, that means that politicians tend to have a lot more influence on them. And they were able to put enough pressure on these two institutions to have a major hand in what happened in 2008. For years, congressional Democrats pretended all was well at Fannie and Freddie, and that all the warnings were coming from mean people who didn't want the poor to have a chance to own their own homes. Numerous Democrats really did say that, believe it or not. Republicans have since used the Democrats' sorry record as a bludgeon against them, but their own record on spending, debt, and government intervention is nothing to be proud of. Republicans, by and large, have also supported the endless march of government bailouts, which aren't exactly examples of the free market in action. So one of the things that's gone on since at least the 1930s is something called redlining. And redlining is the idea that banks or whoever it is that is giving out loans is going to deny minorities, in this case specifically blacks, they're going to deny them the opportunity to get home loans simply because of the color of their skin, not because of what their credit looks like, not because of what their income looks like, not because of anything that's actually related to buying a house, but simply because of the color of their skin. Okay? And obviously, this is a big problem. And we now have anti-discrimination laws that take care of things like this. But there are also reasons why you wouldn't want anybody, no matter what their skin tone is, to get a home loan. If you make $10,000 a year, you cannot afford to buy a house. And if a person is denied the opportunity to buy a house because of something like this, there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But what happened is since especially the 1970s, Democrats have really played it up going after big banks. You're going to start to recognize this a lot, calling the big banks evil and saying that they were denying worthy applicants of home loans, which in a lot of cases was not the case. A lot of people were being denied home loans because they couldn't afford it. The Republicans, they had a lot of the same issues in that they were trying to, again, appeal to different blocks of voters in order to be able to continue in power or to keep their seat in Congress. And what they'll do is they will sponsor legislation or they will vote for legislation that increases the size of the government. Now, when I say this, what I mean by that is they increase the size of the government by allocating more money, borrowing money, creating money to create different programs that will benefit different groups. And again, those things are all done because then when it comes time for re-election, they can go to their constituents and they can say, hey, look at what I was able to get for you. You wouldn't have this if it wasn't for me. Therefore, you should vote for me because I will make sure that you continue to get that. And maybe there will be other things on down the line that you're going to get because you elected me to be your representative. This happens all the time. Back to the reading. But even many of those who describe themselves as supporters of the free market have failed to grasp the heart of the problem. To be sure, they have pinpointed legislation like the Community Reinvestment Act, which we're going to look at in Chapter 2, that certainly didn't help matters. In pointing fingers at specific programs, however, Republicans have diverted attention to the patient's runny nose and away from his cancer. So what Woods is saying here is that instead of looking at the causes of the crash, we're looking at the symptoms of the crash. So we know that people lost their jobs. We know that people lost their homes. Those are symptoms of what the cause was. Almost nobody in Washington and precious few elsewhere has been willing to question the greatest single government intervention in the economy and the institution whose fingerprints are all over our current mess, America's central bank, the Federal Reserve System. One of the most important jobs of the Federal Reserve is to set what is called the federal funds rate, which is the interest rate that banks are going to charge each other to borrow money overnight. For that reason, it's also known as the overnight rate. What this is, if you remember when we talked about liquidity, liquidity is the idea of being able to take something and turn it into cash very quickly. Well, all banks have to carry a certain amount of cash on them in order to be able to manage bank runs. And if they don't have this cash, then they're in violation of federal regulatory policies. So if a bank is low on liquid assets, is low on cash going into an overnight session, then what they can do is they can borrow money from another bank that has excess cash on hand. What the overnight rate does is it basically helps the banks to know about how much they should be charging in interest for those loans that they give to other banks. But more importantly, what the federal funds rate does is it raises or lowers the cost of borrowing. What does this mean to you? The lower that the federal fund rate is, or the interest rates that are set by the Federal Reserve, then the lower loans will be. So if you want to go and buy a home, your home loan will be lower overall in interest than it would be at a different point in time. Auto loans, same thing. But it also has a peculiar effect on saving. Remember that banks also give interest on savings accounts. But if the federal funds rate is low, say 2%, 1%, even all the way down to 0%, then that also decreases the amount that the bank is going to offer you on a savings account. So what this inherently does is it gives you motivation to not put money into the bank to save because you're receiving a lower rate on it. It also does the same thing with federal treasury bonds. When federal treasury bonds have a lower yield, then what that does is it takes away your motivation to put your money into savings bonds and instead to go and put your money into other things like stocks, which will get you a greater yield on your investment. So you can see that the federal funds rate is an incredibly important thing, and by manipulating it, the government can then manipulate how you, the consumer, behave as well. We're going to go back to top of page 3. The Fed is hardly ever mentioned in connection with the crisis, except perhaps as our savior. Major newspapers, magazines, and websites purport to dissect the crisis and identify its causes without mentioning the Fed at all. That's nothing new. There has been no serious discussion of the Federal Reserve in public life for the nearly 100 years since its creation. The Fed is a wonderful thing, and that's that. When President George W. Bush addressed the nation on September 24, 2008, with the proposed bailout for the financial sector meeting stiff resistance from the American public, he devoted some time to addressing what were purportedly the downturn's root causes. Apart from a fleeting and ambiguous reference to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, none of these implicated the government or its central bank. One of the rules of American political life is that inflationary money policy by the Fed is never to be mentioned as the source of any of the country's problems, much less the cause of the boom-bust business cycle. So by lowering interest rates, one of the things that can happen is that you can have inflation as a result. Okay. Now, inflation is not what everybody thinks it is, and people think that inflation is something to do with my money is going to be worth less. That's actually the cause, that's actually the effect of inflation. So inflation is an increase in a nation's money supply. So if we have $10 trillion in circulation and we increase that by 10% to $11 trillion in circulation, that's going to have a serious effect on the value of each individual dollar. So what happens is, as they inflate the amount of money in the supply, that then causes each individual dollar to be worth less. One of the easy ways you can look at this is you all know that there's 160 trillion Zimbabwean dollars hanging on my wall. Okay? Now, that 160 trillion Zimbabwe dollars, that amounts to about $8 American. That's how much I bought them off of eBay for. So just because you increase the amount of money in the supply, that does not mean that you're actually going to help to improve the economy. One of the other historical example that we've got is the Weimar Republic in Germany. So recall that after the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, the Germans were supposed to pay reparations to France for all of the damage that was caused in France during the war. Well, Germany also had a little bit of rebuilding to do, but more importantly, they were being asked to give tons and tons and tons of money over to the French in the 1920s. There was also a short depression in 1920 that we'll talk about a little bit later. What this did is it caused Germany to go through a pretty rough financial period. And not only was the economy in rough shape, but politically, the Weimar Constitution was not really all that strong of a document. It wasn't really what the Germans needed. One of the things that the German government, the Weimar Republic government, did was to increase the amount of money in the money supply. So they took an inflationary strategy in order to make sure that their people didn't starve or what have you. That way they could also pay the French back. Well, the French wouldn't like this because now each dollar that the Germans are giving or each mark that the Germans are giving is worth less and is not going to go as far for the French as what they had hoped. The effect that it had in Germany is that if you had been putting money away, if you had been saving your entire life, because of the amount of money that they put into circulation, money that you may have saved your entire life that could have bought you a car and a boat and maybe a nice house for retirement, all of that could no longer even buy you a loaf of bread. And so that's the danger that we have with an inflationary money strategy. That's why the Fed has to be very careful to watch what's happening with inflation when they employ this strategy. So that's the deal behind inflation. Very, very important concept that you guys definitely need to know. Now, moving on back into the book. Very last sentence of the first full paragraph on page 3. The president stuck to the script, not a single word about the central bank.
Good evening. This is an extraordinary period for America's economy. Over the past few weeks, many Americans have felt anxiety about their finances and their future. I understand their worry and their frustration. We've seen triple-digit swings in the stock market. Major financial institutions have teetered on the edge of collapse, and some have failed. As uncertainty has grown, many banks have restricted lending. Credit markets have frozen, and families and businesses have found it harder to borrow money. We are in the midst of a serious financial crisis, and the federal government is responding with decisive action. We boosted confidence in money market mutual funds and acted to prevent major investors from intentionally driving down stocks for their own personal gain. Most importantly, my administration is working with Congress to address the root cause behind much of the instability in our markets. Financial assets related to home mortgages have lost value during the housing decline, and the banks holding these assets have restricted credit. As a result, our entire economy is in danger. So I propose that the federal government reduce the risk posed by these troubled assets and supply urgently needed money so banks and other financial institutions can avoid collapse and resume lending. This rescue effort is not aimed at preserving any individual company or industry. It is aimed at preserving America's overall economy. It will help American consumers and businesses get credit to meet their daily needs and create jobs. And it will help send a signal to markets around the world that America's financial system is back on track. I know many Americans have questions tonight. How did we reach this point in our economy? How will the solution I propose work? And what does this mean for your financial future? These are good questions, and they deserve clear answers. First, how did our economy reach this point? Well, most economists agree that the problems we are witnessing today developed over a long period of time. For more than a decade, a massive amount of money flowed into the United States from investors abroad because our country is an attractive and secure place to do business. This large influx of money to U.S. banks and financial institutions, along with low interest rates, made it easier for Americans to get credit. These developments allowed more families to borrow money for cars and homes and college tuition, some for the first time. They allowed more entrepreneurs to get loans to start new businesses and create jobs. Unfortunately, there were also some serious negative consequences, particularly in the housing market. Easy credit, combined with the faulty assumption that home values would continue to rise, led to excesses and bad decisions. Many mortgage lenders approved loans for borrowers without carefully examining their ability to pay. Many borrowers took out loans larger than they could afford, assuming that they could sell or refinance their homes at a higher price later on. Optimism about housing values also led to a boom in home construction. Eventually, the number of new houses exceeded the number of people willing to buy them. And with supply exceeding demand, housing prices fell. and this created a problem. Borrowers with adjustable rate mortgages who had been planning to sell or refinance their homes at a higher price were stuck with homes worth less than expected, along with mortgage payments they could not afford. As a result, many mortgage holders began to default. These widespread defaults had effects far beyond the housing market. See, in today's mortgage industry, home loans are often packaged together and converted into financial products called mortgage-backed securities. These securities were sold to investors around the world. Many investors assumed these securities were trustworthy and asked few questions about their actual value. Two of the leading purchasers of mortgage-backed securities were Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Because these companies were chartered by Congress, many believed they were guaranteed by the federal government. This allowed them to borrow enormous sums of money, fuel the market for questionable investments, and put our financial system at risk. The decline in the housing market set off a domino effect across our economy. When home values declined, borrowers defaulted on their mortgages, and investors holding mortgage-backed securities began to incur serious losses. Before long, these securities became so unreliable that they were not being bought or sold. Investment banks such as Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers found themselves saddled with large amounts of assets they could not sell. They ran out of money needed to meet their immediate obligations, and they faced imminent collapse. Other banks found themselves in severe financial trouble. These banks began holding on to their money, and lending dried up, and the gears of the American financial system began grinding to a halt. With the situation becoming more precarious by the day, I faced a choice: to step in with dramatic government action, or to stand back and allow the irresponsible actions of some to undermine the financial security of all. I'm a strong believer in free enterprise, so my natural instinct is to oppose government intervention. I believe companies that make bad decisions should be allowed to go out of business. Under normal circumstances, I would have followed this course. But these are not normal circumstances. The market is not functioning properly. There has been a widespread loss of confidence, and major sectors of America's financial system are at risk of shutting down. The government's top economic experts warn that without immediate action by Congress, America could slip into a financial panic, and a distressing scenario would unfold. More banks could fail, including some in your community. The stock market would drop even more, which would reduce the value of your retirement account. The value of your home could plummet. Foreclosures would rise dramatically. And if you own a business or a farm, you would find it harder and more expensive to get credit. More businesses would close their doors, and millions of Americans could lose their jobs. Even if you have good credit history, it would be more difficult for you to get the loans you need to buy a car or send your children to college. And ultimately, our country could experience a long and painful recession. Fellow citizens, we must not let this happen. I appreciate the work of leaders from both parties in both houses of Congress to address this problem and to make improvements to the proposal my administration sent to them. There is a spirit of cooperation between Democrats and Republicans and between Congress and this administration. In that spirit, I've invited Senators McCain and Obama to join congressional leaders of both parties at the White House tomorrow to help speed our discussions toward a bipartisan bill. I know that an economic rescue package will present a tough vote for many members of Congress. It is difficult to pass a bill that commits so much of the taxpayers' hard-earned money. I also understand the frustration of responsible Americans who pay their mortgages on time, file their tax returns every April 15th, and are reluctant to pay the cost of excesses on Wall Street. But given the situation we are facing, not passing a bill now would cost these Americans much more later. Many Americans are asking, how would a rescue plan work? After much discussion, there is now widespread agreement on the principles such a plan would include. It would remove the risk posed by the troubled assets, including mortgage-backed securities, now clogging the financial system. This would free banks to resume the flow of credit to American families and businesses. Any rescue plan should also be designed to ensure that taxpayers are protected. It should welcome the participation of financial institutions, large and small. It should make certain that failed executives do not receive a windfall from your tax dollars. It should establish a bipartisan board to oversee the plan's implementation, and it should be enacted as soon as possible. In close consultation with Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, and SEC Chairman Chris Cox, I announced a plan on Friday. First, the plan is big enough to solve a serious problem. Under our proposal, the federal government would put up to $700 billion taxpayer dollars on the line to purchase troubled assets that are clogging the financial system. In the short term, this will free up banks to resume the flow of credit to American families and businesses, and this will help our economy grow. Second, as markets have lost confidence in mortgage-backed securities, their prices have dropped sharply. Yet the value of many of these assets will likely be higher than their current price because the vast majority of Americans will ultimately pay off their mortgages. The government is the one institution with the patience and resources to buy these assets at their current low prices and hold them until markets return to normal. And when that happens, money will flow back to the Treasury as these assets are sold, and we expect that much, if not all, of the tax dollars we invest will be paid back. The final question is, what does this mean for your economic future? Well, the primary purpose of the steps I've outlined tonight is to safeguard the financial security of American workers and families and small businesses. The federal government also continues to enforce laws and regulations protecting your money. The Treasury Department recently offered government insurance for money market mutual funds. And through the FDIC, every savings account, checking account, and certificate of deposit is insured by the federal government for up to $100,000. The FDIC has been in existence for 75 years, and no one has ever lost a penny on an insured deposit, and this will not change. Once this crisis is resolved, there will be time to update our financial regulatory structures. Our 21st century global economy remains regulated largely by outdated 20th century laws. Recently, we've seen how one company can grow so large that its failure jeopardizes the entire financial system. Earlier this year, Secretary Paulson proposed a blueprint that would modernize our financial regulations. For example, the Federal Reserve would be authorized to take a closer look at the operations of companies across the financial spectrum and ensure that their practices do not threaten overall financial stability. There are other good ideas, and members of Congress should consider them. As they do, they must ensure that efforts to regulate Wall Street do not end up hampering our economy's ability to grow. In the long run, Americans have good reason to be confident in our economic strength. Despite corrections in the marketplace and instances of abuse, democratic capitalism is the best system ever devised. It has unleashed the talents and the productivity and entrepreneurial spirit of our citizens. It has made this country the best place in the world to invest and do business. And it gives our economy the flexibility and resilience to absorb shocks, adjust, and bounce back. Our economy is facing a moment of great challenge, but we've overcome tough challenges before, and we will overcome this one. I know that Americans sometimes get discouraged by the tone in Washington and the seemingly endless partisan struggles. Yet history has shown that in times of real trial, elected officials rise to the occasion. And together we will show the world once again what kind of country America is. A nation that tackles problems head on, where leaders come together to meet great tests, and where people of every background can work hard, develop their talents, and realize their dreams. Thank you for listening. May God bless you.
We're again going to take a look at how markets are similar to a rubber band. In this chart, the blue line represents equilibrium for GDP. You'll notice that it's running from the lower left-hand corner to the top, so that means that it has a positive slope. This is similar to how all economies act. Now, the curved line that has just appeared, that's going to show you the market trying to find equilibrium. So it's going to look like a wave going above and then back below, and then back above, and back below the equilibrium. Because the market, no person, there's nothing that knows exactly where equilibrium is at every specific moment at all times. So it's always searching to find that equilibrium. So you can see that anytime that it goes above equilibrium, you have a surplus. So market forces are pushing it back down towards equilibrium. On the other hand, anytime you go below it, you end up with a shortage. There's not enough goods or services on the market. So the natural tendency is for market forces to push back up and towards equilibrium. Now on this slide, what we're going to take a look at is what happens when the government interferes within the economy and begins to put forces on the economy that should not be there, artificial forces on the economy that should not be there. Well, one of the things that we remember is that anytime that you have a president or you have a sitting Congress or whomever, they always want to be governing in a time of prosperity. So they want to see that economy continuing to go up no matter what. So what you'll see from presidents, senators, congressmen, whomever, they're always going to look to introduce legislation, or they're always going to try to introduce some sort of executive orders or anything that is going to make the economy continue to go up. Because if they want to get reelected, that's really what they're going to need, specifically presidents. So the first step in this process is for non-market forces to create false demand and it spurs surplus production. So instead of the market naturally going down back towards equilibrium, the market is spurred to continue moving upwards. This is what we call our bubble. Okay? Natural forces cannot correct the market, which leads to this bubble, and then eventually the bubble has to burst. The market can't absorb any more, the market can't absorb any more supply for the demand that exists, and what you have is a serious drop in prices. And so instead of getting this nice natural curve that flows above and below equilibrium, what you end up with is the bubble bursts and it goes much, much further down past equilibrium than it normally would have done on its own. This creates a mania, which creates sell-offs, and then that decreases demand. Then the next step in the process is government doesn't want the economy to lag behind, so they feel as though they have to do something to get the economy spurred again. But often the things that they do to spur it are the things that are going to actually keep it languishing for a longer period of time. So governments scramble to head off inflation, they spend, and through misallocation of resources, they slow the recovery. Several weeks later, the president announced his intention to hold an international summit in Washington on the financial crisis. As investment advisor Mike Shedlock put it, in response to the credit crisis, President Bush is gathering up all the people who did not see what was coming, denied what was happening, and then failed to see the implications of what was indeed happening. He spoke of the need to preserve the foundations of democratic capitalism, the usual boilerplate when the federal government intends another round of burdens on the free market. Various presidents and prime ministers were invited. The response was predictably inane. Upon hearing of the proposed summit, the French president and the European Commission president indicated their desire to see offshore tax havens targeted. Okay, now what does an offshore tax haven have to do with the financial crisis that was sparked by the housing market in the United States? The answer is absolutely nothing. What these politicians saw was an opportunity to shore up some loopholes that they may have had in their own laws or in international laws, and they wanted to go and they wanted to get people's money to bring it in to the government coffers so that they could then spend it on other things that would then do what? Help them to get reelected. Okay? It's essentially taking people's money in order to buy votes. It goes on to say that the International Monetary Fund further empowered and limitations imposed on executive pay, among other irrelevant suggestions. Again, what does executive pay have to do with anything? It was simply a campaign issue that they could easily snatch onto, that they could then eliminate the problem that didn't actually exist. As usual, the possibility that artificially low interest rates of 1% might have set the world's economies on unsustainable paths was not mentioned then or at the November 15th summit itself, which wound up being a relatively toothless exchange of platitudes. In October 2008, the editor-in-chief of the Slate Group, which publishes Slate, the popular website, proclaimed that the financial crisis was surely the end of libertarianism since it supposedly proved what a mess unregulated markets could cause. Okay, so libertarianism is a political ideology where the adherents believe that the government should be limited as much as possible and that the freedoms of the people should be maximized to such an extent that even some things that society considers taboo should be allowed. As long as it doesn't hurt other people, then you should be allowed to do it. That's sort of where libertarianism is at. Now, when it comes to the economy, that means that the government shouldn't regulate the economy to the extent that it does. Now, a libertarian would acknowledge that there are going to be some regulations that are necessary. There are going to be laws that are necessary, but they should only be put in place if absolutely necessary. Okay, so back to the reading. Not once were central banking or the Federal Reserve mentioned, even though these are not creations of the free market and their destructive behavior is not the market's fault. To be sure, a few important exceptions to this general rule can be found, such as investment mavens Jim Rogers, Peter Schiff, and James Grant. Rogers, when asked on CNBC what two courses of action he would take if he were appointed Fed chair, replied that he would abolish the Fed and then resign. Not by coincidence, these men were also among the very few who predicted the current crisis. So-called mainstream commentators, whose credibility should have completely evaporated by now, laughed at their pessimistic predictions and their criticisms of Fed policy. Thanks to YouTube, you can watch a parade of blockheads actually laughing at Peter Schiff in 2006 for predicting exactly what has happened since. As predictably as night follows day, the dopes who didn't see the crisis coming and said everything was fine are the ones George W. Bush and Barack Obama alike have looked to for advice on how to reverse it. We're in trouble. Okay, so take a look at the next two videos. The first one involves Peter Schiff talking to a man named Art Laffer. Art Laffer was a big part of the Reagan administration. He came up with something in economics known as the Laffer curve. Basically, what it is, it's the law of diminishing returns applied to taxation. So it's a very simple concept. If you tax the people at 0%, the government's going to take in 0% revenue. If you tax the people at 100%, the government's going to take in 0% revenue. Because if you tax everybody at 100%, what reason is there to work? So Laffer came up with this curve that says that there's a point somewhere between 0% and 100%, which is the maximum that the government should be collecting in taxes in order to make sure the economy hums along the best possibly it can. So he's not exactly a real liberal guy when it comes to economics, but he debates Peter Schiff, and Schiff wins the little bet that they placed. Then the second video is Ron Paul, who is a libertarian member of the Republican Party. So he's not a member of the Libertarian Party because if he ran as libertarian, he would never win. So he runs as a Republican in order to get elected by the state of Kentucky. Now he's no longer in his seat in the Senate. His son Rand has now taken that seat.
This evening, the stock market had a good day today. Oil prices pulled back sharply. But despite the Dow hitting a 3-month high, more and more analysts are cautioning that a recession could be just around the corner. Joining us now to debate the issue, recession or not, we're going to be joined by Art Laffer. He's Chief Investment Officer of Laffer Investments and former economic advisor to President Reagan. And Peter Schiff, he's president of Euro Pacific Capital. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. Peter, I want to start with you. Although there are more and more people saying that the U.S. economy will be in a recession next year, it is still a minority position. Why do you think that a recession is coming, and just how bad is it going to be?
I think it's going to be pretty bad, and whether it starts in 07 or 8, I think, is immaterial. And I also think it's going to last not just for quarters, but for years. See, the basic problem with the U.S. economy is we have too much consumption and borrowing and not enough production and savings. And what's going to happen is the American consumer is basically going to stop consuming and start rebuilding his savings, especially when he sees his home equity evaporate. And when you have the economy 70% consumption, you can't address those imbalances without a recession. You know, rather than the recession being resisted, it should really be embraced, because the disease is all this debt-financed consumption. The cure is that we stop consuming and start saving and producing again, and that's a recession. And sometimes, you know, medicine tastes bad, but you got to swallow it.
Art Laffer, you hear him. He says the consumer is going to slow down in order to rebuild the savings. And you know that 2/3 of the American economy is driven by the consumer. Do you believe that?
No, I don't believe any of it whatsoever, Michelle. Excuse me. But, you know, what he's saying is that savings is way down in this country, but wealth has risen dramatically. The United States economy has never been better shape. There is no tax increase coming in the next couple of years. Monetary policy is spectacular. We have freer trade than ever before. And not only that, but there are no incomes policies things here. I think Peter's just totally off base, and I don't think it's going to be. I mean, I just don't know where he's getting his stuff. The
well, one of us is
well.
off base, but it's definitely not me. I mean, it's not wealth that's increased in the last few years. We haven't increased our productive capacity. All that's increased is the paper values of our stocks and real estate. But that's not real wealth, no more than the NASDAQ was wealth. When you see the stock market come down and the real estate bubble burst, all that phony wealth is going to evaporate. And all that's going to be left is all the debt that we accumulated to foreigners.
Peter, I'm going to take a bet with you on this one. I'll bet you a penny on this one that if you'll sign a letter saying that if you're wrong, you'll sign a letter that you were wrong to me in this, but you're just way off base. There is nothing out there that tells us we're going to have a nice slowdown, but it's not going to be a crash.
Let me ask you this.
I'll bet you a lot more than a penny.
A lot of folks out there point to the housing market, and they say that a huge percentage of the jobs created, some argue as much as 30% of the job creation over the last few years, has been because of the housing boom, whether it's construction, whether it's mortgage brokers, real estate brokers, etc. And if that all goes away, what happens to those jobs?
There will be lots of things to fill it back up again, Michelle.
Such as?
You know, the neat thing about this economy is we have a lot of flexibility in what we produce and what we have in the wealth. And housing has filled a huge gap coming here, and other things will fill in that gap. It's really not a housing economy. This is an economy that's driven by good economic policies, by good monetary policy, by good trade policy, and it's working beautifully. And unless you change those, it just won't happen.
I suppose it's good if you're an investor in gold or oil or other foreign assets, but it's certainly not good from the point of view of the United States. And, you know, from the real estate, it's not just the wealth effect or the jobs that directly come from real estate, but because we've had such artificially low interest rates, which are quickly going to become a thing of the past,
I don't know about that. Hold on,
silly.
Peter. The 10-year yield is still... You know, the Fed keeps going and going and going here, and the
what
long
I'm
end of the
talking
curve
about
doesn't
is
move.
Thank you, Michelle.
A lot of people have adjustable rate mortgages that are going to reset over the next couple of years, and people are going to see their monthly mortgage payments go up by 50%, 100%. And a lot of that is going to take a lot of spending away from the economy, because people are going to be spending whatever money they have.
And what about
on
the people who earn the interest, Peter? I mean, come on, it's a zero-sum game. Every interest dollar paid is interest dollar earned.
The people that earn the dollars are in China and in Japan and in Europe. They're not in America anymore. We don't owe it to ourselves. We owe it abroad.
Oh, my goodness. I have never heard so many mistakes made in seriatim in my life, Peter.
Well, then you ought to listen to your own clip.
Well, I do a lot, and you know, what can I tell you, Peter? It's a bet of a penny in your honor on the stake, and mine too.
Peter, when you talk about selling to China, to India, etc., what is wrong with that? If we are selling products, if they're buying products around the world, that lifts the entire global economy.
The problem is we're not selling them products. They are making products and sending them here.
We're outsourcing Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke to them. That's why they're holding those dollars. It's not as a favor to us.
Well,
My
sure
goodness.
it is. Look, we're running up $60 billion a month trade deficit. That means that the world is providing us with $60 billion more of goods and services that we can afford to pay for.
Peter, that's not true. No, listen, Peter, for 1 second. They are holding deposits in the U.S. not as a favor to us because they like holding them there. We are outsourcing our monetary policy to China and to a lot of the rest of the world, and they're paying us huge amounts of seigniorage gain for the act of providing them with a banking system and monetary policy. It's called seigniorage gain. Gosh.
All we're providing them with is inflation, and they're accumulating assets while we're accumulating liabilities. We've got to service this debt. We've got to pay interest on this. We're not borrowing to produce.
We ran trade deficits from 1640 until 1870, 230 years of trade deficits, and we built our country on foreign capital.
You're missing the most important aspect. Back then, we borrowed to build factories, to build infrastructure. We were borrowing to produce. Now we're borrowing to remodel our kitchens, to buy big screen TVs, to take vacations.
Peter, in all these years that we've been running these trade deficits, the wealth of the average American household has been going up.
No, it hasn't.
By what metric are you using?
The average American is going deeper and deeper into debt. He's struggling to get by. And all that happens is some appraiser tries to say that your house is worth all this money. This is an illusion.
Peter, hold on 1 second. Art, what measure are you using when you talk about...
I'm using the household survey from the Federal Reserve Board, which shows American household net wealth. You know, he's using a savings rate measure from the National Income and Product Accounts, which is totally inappropriate for the purpose he's doing it. Look, and I don't know how to respond to it when he doesn't know the numbers.
Art, why do a husband and a wife both have to work to provide enough income to support a family?
Because they love the jobs at low tax rates. They like
working.
Don't
love these jobs.
Of course they do.
Most women with children aren't working because they love their job. They're working because they need the income. They can't afford
now you're going into
with lower tax rates, it makes it much more valuable to work. Gee, and lower interest rates, you can buy more. It's great.
I don't know, Peter. Are you suggesting that most women would stay home?
I think a lot of women, especially, I see women, 7 months pregnant sometimes when I'm out, waiting tables. They don't want to be there. They need to be there because their husband doesn't make enough after he finished paying taxes to support the family. But what we need to do in America is get back to the business of saving again and producing again. We just can't keep accumulating debt. We just can't put this consumption on a national credit card and assume that just because a crisis hasn't happened yet, that it's never going to happen.
I don't know, Peter. I would argue that a lot of women like to work, putting aside the women who are 7, 8, 9 months pregnant. But I think a lot of women enjoy their job and enjoy the privilege that men have had for a very long time, which is to get out of the house and be productive in many ways, not just
Michelle.
at raising children.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, I barely participated. I enjoyed that actually quite a lot, just listening to both of you go at it. So we're going to have you back again, Art Laffer and Peter Schiff, on whether or not we're going to see a recession.
Anytime. I want to collect that penny.
Thank you. I'll collect it with a nice note from you, Peter.
In fact, that's about all the dollar's going to be worth is a penny.
All right, coming up.
You made a bet a couple of years ago with a guy named Peter Schiff on TV, right? He was saying that we consume too much. He said that we are running up the credit card. His quote was, the real estate bubble is going to burst and all that phony wealth is going to evaporate. You said the U.S. economy has never been in better shape. He said a crash is coming in 07 or 08, and you said a nice slowdown is the worst we're going to get. Have you paid off that bet?
No, I haven't.
Coming up next, former presidential candidate and Congressman Ron Paul, plus the editor of the Huffington Post, Ariana Huffington. You're watching another bi-coastal edition, I guess we're calling it, of Morning Joe, live from New York and from the Fortune Most Powerful Women Summit in Carlsbad, California. We'll be right back.
Here with us now, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post, Ariana Huffington, joins us. And with us from Washington, Republican representative from Texas and member of the Financial Services and Joint Economic Committees, Congressman Ron Paul. Congressman, thanks very much for joining us. Your thoughts on the president's speech and hope that we actually are going to turn our economic problems around?
Well, at least he was a little bit cautious. He wasn't bragging that it was turned around, and he shouldn't be because we have a long way to go. He suggests that the answer will be easy credit to make sure people get some low-interest loans. Without really looking at it, he should realize that we got into this mess because we had easy credit and artificially low-interest loans, and we pushed this on the people, caused all the malinvestment and the bubble to form. So you can hardly solve the problem of a bursting bubble with trying to reinflate and create a new bubble. We've gotten away with it now for several decades, but it's not going to happen this time.
Okay, but how do we not recreate a new bubble? How do we not find ourselves in this situation?
Let's just
Can you
stop
hear
right
him?
here. No, I can't. But I can read lips. And, you know, Ron, I'm having a problem with my IFE. But I actually lifted a speech that you made in the Banking Committee on September 10th, 2003. I remember that date because your words were so dramatic. Ron,
prophetic.
You said, while everybody else was saying, oh, if we don't help people out through these loans of Fannie and Freddie, then we're just horrible people. We hate poor people. You said, and you predicted, you said, if we continue to inflate this bubble this way, the housing crisis is going to cause an explosion and there's going to be damage worldwide. What did you know, Ron Paul, in 2003 that nobody else on the Banking Committee or the United States Congress or in the media know? What did you know?
Well, I think it reflects an understanding of economics. I didn't know anything special other than the fact that I had studied Austrian economics, and their understanding of the business cycle comes from the Federal Reserve, the creation of credit. And we've been working with Keynesian economics since the Depression. We've had perpetual bubbles and recessions and ups and downs and inflation. And Nixon really sealed it over when he says we're all Keynesians now. And we still are in Washington. They still use Keynesian economics to try to solve these problems. So it isn't all that complex. If you interest rates are very, very important. Prices are very, very important in a free market. And when you distort prices, like when wage and price controls, everything sees up. Nothing can happen. But when a Federal Reserve comes in and fixes the prices of interest rates, you deceive the savers and the spenders and the investors. People believe that there's been a lot of savings and interest rates are very low. And that wasn't the case. We weren't saving a penny. We were giving low interest rates because we were creating money out of thin air, and that's why I keep coming back to the Federal Reserve. It was the policies of the Federal Reserve that created this, and we shouldn't have been surprised at all that we eventually had this tremendous financial crisis.
So, Congressman, is your solution then to get rid of the Federal Reserve then? I mean, or what else are you proposing we do here to make sure this kind of stuff doesn't happen again?
Well, first off, we ought to obey the Constitution, live within our means, and balance the budget, quit warmongering, and quit the welfare state. Those minor things like that. But eventually, you don't need the Federal Reserve. No, it's caused too much trouble. Central banking has always been harmful. It's a seductive way of financing big government. Conservatives love it because you can pay the military bills. Liberals love it because you can pay the welfare state bill. But it's all deception. It's all a tax. It eventually destroys and hurts the very people you're trying to help. You try to help poor people by giving them stuff for free, but you end up giving them inflation. They're the first ones to lose their jobs. They're the ones who suffer the most from inflation. We have inflation today much more so than anybody admits because that's why the cost of medicine is so high and the cost of education is so high. It's the devaluation of the dollar. So with all this good intentions of helping poor people, the very people who are doing this are actually making it much more harmful and hurting those they want to help.
Ariana, let's talk about September 15th today. You have been writing in the Huffington Post for some time about the fact that this administration and the last administration couldn't stand up to Wall Street, couldn't pass the tough regulations that need to be passed. You still think that's the case? And out here, Andy was just saying you took on Larry Summers.
Well, yesterday when Larry Summers spoke, I asked him whether he really believed that they would have fundamental reform of Wall Street, because they've been saying that ever since the administration took office. And the truth is that they're all like the captain of a ship telling us we're going to go in this new direction, but the autopilot in the boiler room is set in a different direction than the one they want to take us.
The same direction.
The same direction that we're going now.
Yeah.
And the autopilot is really controlled by the lobbyists in Washington. You know, thousands of lobbyists spending literally tens of millions of dollars undermining reform efforts. Remember what happened? This is critical to the Cram Down Amendment. And I'd love to ask Congressman Paul about that. The Cram Down Amendment was critical to the foreclosure reform efforts, because without that, without being able to modify your mortgages, nothing is going to work. So now we're having thousands of foreclosures every day, which is affecting the whole community. These are not just people who took crazy subprime loans. These are people who are losing their homes because they lost their jobs. There was a moving article in the New York Times about over 1 million school children are going to school right now homeless. This is having a huge impact, not just on this generation, but on the next one. And the administration is still more concerned with saving Citigroup and saving the big banks, the big 5 banks that are now much bigger than they were a year ago.
And you know the thing, and you started to bring it up, and it's a question, Ron, that I keep raising on this show. Why is it that the same people, and I know, Ariana, you'll agree with me, the same people that got us in this mess, whether you're talking about Tim Geithner, that was at the wheel of that ship for a very long time, or whether you're talking about Larry Summers, that was in part of some things that happened in 98 and 99, or whether you're talking about Hank Paulson, that was pushing for 40-to-1 leverage rates. Why is it that these same people that got us in trouble are the same people that are still running this economy?
Well, they're in charge and they have the power and they still believe it. I mean, they're believers in Keynesian economics, but they're the ones who caused the trouble. Look, the president wants to give more power, to the Federal Reserve. And if you come anywhere close to my understanding of the Federal Reserve, that's the last thing. I want to get rid of the Federal Reserve, and here he wants to enhance it. But I think they're locked in. Whether they're Republicans or Democrats, they're going to support the corporations. Even in medical care reform, who do you think is going to come out well on this? Corporations, drug companies, and insurance companies, they're being protected. Some conservatives accuse Obama of wanting socialized medicine. I don't think so. I think he wants to perpetuate corporatism, whether it's in the financial markets or whether it's in medical care or whatever. So I just think that the difficulty is the transition. How do you go from where we need to go without hurting people? And quite frankly, you can't do it. People are going to be hurt one way or the other. I just want to minimize the pain, and I just don't want to put the pain on the taxpayer.
You would agree with Ron Paul in that corporations are getting, you believe, a free ride off of this administration as well as the last.
Well, I would also agree with Congressman Paul that this is not capitalism. This is not free enterprise capitalism.
This is not capitalism
This
at all.
is definitely not capitalism. This is really oligopoly.
Yeah.
And that's why we have, 92 smaller regional banks that have failed, 92 banks. But the 5 big banks are bigger than ever. Their profits are growing. Their toxic assets are still on the books. That's what I want us to discuss. Congressman Paul, how come a year later, after the bailout, which was supposed to get rid of the toxic assets are still there and still a potential time bomb for another economic meltdown?
And Ron, we're up against a hard break, so give us a 30-second answer.
Well, because they haven't solved the problem. Some of the toxic assets are now owned by the taxpayers. That's one thing. But this is my argument. They won't get rid of them. You have to liquidate it. You should allow the correction to occur in 1 year and get all those bad assets out of the way. The fact that they're propping them up means that we're working very hard to perpetuate this problem and turn it into the second Great Depression, if it's not as bad, but much worse if we continue to do what we're doing by not allowing those toxic assets to be liquidated.
Absolutely right. Congressman Ron Paul.
He was right before.
We're going to continue this conversation on the radio. You'll be our guest. It's 10 a.m. to noon Eastern Time on WABCRadio.com. Congressman Ron Paul.
Thank you.
The book is called The End of the Fed. Thank you so much for being our guest on Morning Joe. We'll talk to you on the radio.